Several years ago, I was, I was visiting friends on the Isle of Palms off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. And I awoke one morning to the first light of an incredible sunrise over the Atlantic Ocean. So I laced up my cross trainers and headed toward the beach inlet near their house. I wanted to capture a photo of the beautiful pinks and brilliant oranges in that beautifully sunrise-hued sky. The tide was out, and the tidal pools, unlike those on our barrier islands, the marsh grasses were jutted up in a kind of a grayish brown-black goo, brown-black earth. I was fixated, though, on the rising sun while walking to find the perfect spot to capture that sunrise on camera, when all of a sudden, I was swallowed up to my knees in pluff mud. Now, we're not talking about bare earth that got rained on and turned squishy. We're talking about shoe-sucking, boat-sticking, livestock-eating mud. This is the mother of all mud. On that morning walk, I was enveloped in this smelly, slick mud with no seeming possible or plausible way out. Talk about a fail. Well, that's where we find the prophet Jeremiah this morning, stuck in the mud and sinking deep. For the past several weeks, we've been considering the question of what to do when things go wrong. What do we do when our plans go sideways? How do we deal with failure and disappointment? And as it turns out, the prophet Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, has plenty to teach us about trusting God and moving forward in life's most difficult and trying times. Jeremiah was born in a small village, as we've learned, about an hour's walk from Jerusalem. And as a young boy, he was called to speak on behalf of God, to deliver a very difficult but truthful message to God's people. And during his life, he saw the people of Judah turn from God. And in turn, Judah was defeated internally by rampant immorality and externally by military might. He saw Jerusalem captured and pillaged and its residents taken into slavery or put into exile. And still, they ignored Jeremiah's warnings and pleas to turn back to God. So here's the situation where we find the prophet this morning. Jeremiah is preaching to the people as Jerusalem is once again under siege. The Babylonians are literally at the gates. The puppet king, Zedekiah, is paralyzed by fear and vacillates with the political winds. So Jeremiah is sharing this message from God that anyone who would go out to the Babylonians and surrender to them would live. He was basically saying, the Babylonians at this point have the backing of the Holy One of Israel, and resistance is not merely futile, but fatal. But the officials of Judah, well, the powers that be, they did not take this to be a properly motivational speech. So in Jeremiah chapter 38, beginning in verse 4, this is where we find the prophet. Then the officials said to the king, "This man must be put to death. By saying such things, he is discouraging the few remaining troops left in the city, as well as the people. This man doesn't seek their welfare, but their ruin." "He's in your hands," King Zedekiah said, "for the king can do nothing to stop you." So they seized Jeremiah, threw him into the cistern of the royal prince Malchiah within the prison quarters, and lowered him down by ropes. Now there wasn't any water in the cistern, and Jeremiah began to sink into the mud. In the previous chapter, Jeremiah had already been put into prison, but now they put him in solitary confinement, in a cistern, a pit that was designed to catch and hold water, kind of like a well. And I find it ironic that Jeremiah lands at the bottom of the cistern, because at the beginning of his biblical narrative, in the very first chapter, he observes that the people were like cracked cisterns who could not hold water. So here he is in a cistern with no water. It's empty, except for the mud. Jeremiah is alone, walled in the dark, and sinking in the mud. He's been left to die because it wouldn't have been right for the officials to kill a prophet of God. But if he was at the bottom of a well without food and starved to death, stuck deep in the mire with no possibility of rescue, well, he's left to die. His circumstances seem bleak and hopeless. Do you know what it's like to be at the bottom of a pit? Have you ever been stuck? The truth is, we all get stuck at some point. Life happens, right? And sometimes those low points can be overwhelming. You don't know how you're going to move forward after the death of a loved one or the breakup of a marriage. Maybe it's the loss of financial stability or children who are alienated, maybe a health crisis, or it could even be a spiritual struggle. The truth is that we all find ourselves in the pit of despair and desolation. Some of you may find yourselves there right now. So the question is, what do we do? What lessons can we learn from Jeremiah at the bottom of a cistern, stuck in the mud? I want to suggest to you this morning that this account of this particular low point in Jeremiah's life, it can teach us a few things about ourselves and about God. The first is this: we must choose faith over fear. We must make a conscious choice to actively seek God when we're at a low or lowest life point. Jeremiah, he could have focused on the gooey, depressing muck or the stark and barren walls with no handheld or foothold to pull himself out and been overwhelmed with fear. But what I think that Jeremiah did was look up and put his faith in Adonai God, who called him at a very young age and gave him the confidence to speak on behalf of God. What was there left to do but cry out to God? Jeremiah is credited with writing a collection of poetic laments when Jerusalem was under siege. 5 different prayerful poems recorded in the Bible as what we know as the Book of Lamentations. And in the very first chapter, he describes Jerusalem as a forlorn, weeping widow overcome with misery. And perhaps this particular personal experience of Jeremiah, of his misery in the pit, might have even inspired these words from chapter 3. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my paths with blocks of stones, and he has made my paths crooked. Jeremiah would have likely cried out to God because he knew the power of lament, to honestly name our feelings before God and with others. Choosing faith over fear means it's okay to express our suffering and brokenness. In other words, you don't have to pretend and act that everything's okay. You don't have to paste a smile on your face to mask the depth of your sorrow to be faithful. Most importantly, you don't have to disguise your disappointment with God. Jeremiah knew that he could be honest with God, that the God he served was big enough to handle his heartache and anger. This same power to lament, it's available to us as well. Lament can transform our grief, our pain, and our anger into a pathway toward healing, hope, and even a deeper connection with God. Jeremiah must have felt that shift, that deeper connection with God, because in that same chapter of Lamentations, chapter 3, a few verses later, he says this, words that just might be familiar to you. Certainly the faithful love of the Lord hasn't ended. Certainly God's compassion isn't through. They are renewed every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I think, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I'll wait for him. As the son of a priest, I also imagine that Jeremiah had memorized large portions of Israel's prayer book, the book of Psalms. As he called out to God from the bottom of the pit, he may have also recalled these verses from chapter 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Which brings me to another lesson that I think we can learn from Jeremiah in the cistern. Hold on to hope. Hold on to hope because your lowest point is not your last point. Whatever in life, whatever darkness surrounds us, we can cling to hope. Barbara Brown Taylor is an Episcopal priest and professor living in North Georgia, and she's the author of several best-selling books, including Learning to Walk in the Dark and An Altar in the World. She's influenced my faith and shaped my ministry from my days in seminary. I was privileged to hear her speak a few times when I was living in Atlanta. And after one lecture during the Q&A, a friend and colleague in ministry asked her, "What is your definition of hope?" Barbara Brown Taylor responded, "You tell me, what is hope?" Well, my friend silently closed her eyes and I imagine shot up a quick prayer, and then took a deep breath and answered, "God has me, whatever happens. Nothing is impossible with God. Ultimately, all shall be well." Barbara Brown Taylor smiled and nodded. "Yes, thank you." Here's the thing. What Barbara Brown Taylor was saying in all her infinite wisdom is that this is a question that you must answer for yourself. What is your definition of hope? The answer is within you. I have buried deep within my heart this definition of hope. My life is in God's hands. Hope is responsible for every brave, beautiful, and redemptive vignette in my life. There are very few things I know in life for certain, but I do know this: I have to hold on to hope. Hope has saved me when I have been, like Jeremiah, at the bottom of the proverbial pit, when my life has been at its lowest point, and believe me, there's been some pretty low points. Hold on to hope. Well, that morning that I found myself stuck in the pluff mud, I thankfully didn't have to wait for long before a construction worker on his way to a job site saw my plight and came to my rescue in the form of two 2x4s. He helped us extract me and crawl out. Sadly, my shoes were lost to the mud, but I was standing on solid ground. That brings me to the last lesson we can learn from this account of Jeremiah's plight. You see, Jeremiah wasn't in the cistern for very long before he was rescued. We begin picking up the story in chapter 7, or in verse 7. Ebed-Melech, the Cushite, a court official in the royal palace, got word that they had thrown Jeremiah into the cistern. Since the king was sitting at the Benjamin gate, Ebed-Melech left the palace and said to the king, "My master the king, these men have made a terrible mistake in treating the prophet Jeremiah the way they have. They have thrown him into the cistern where he will die of starvation, for there's no bread left in the city." Then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Cushite, "Take 30 men from here and take Jeremiah the prophet out of the cistern before he dies." So Ebed-Melech took the men and returned to the palace, to an underground supply room, where he found some old rags and scraps of clothing. Ebed-Melech lowered them down the cistern by the ropes and called to Jeremiah, "Put these old rags and scraps of clothing under your arms and hold on to the ropes." When Jeremiah did this, they pulled him up by the ropes and got him out of the cistern. After that, Jeremiah remained in the prison quarters. Who is this guy, Ebed-Melech? Well, we don't know much about him. His name in Hebrew means servant of the king, which tells us more about his job and what he does than his true identity. The text tells us also that he's a Cushite, an Ethiopian. He was a stranger, a foreigner, an outsider. He would have been excluded from the temple and its many Jewish rituals. Yet he had a godlier heart than most of the pious ruling class who did participate in these rituals. Ebed-Melech lived in a wicked court, in a corrupt and immoral time, and yet he displays great conviction when he hears Jeremiah has been thrown into the cistern. It makes me wonder, how did he learn about God? About who God is and what God is like? How did he know about God's hesed, God's loving kindness? Well, we don't know, but I'd like to think that it was because of Jeremiah. I think it's possible that Ebed-Melech was the only one who actually listened to Jeremiah. Maybe he was eavesdropping when Jeremiah was preaching, or maybe he sought Jeremiah to ask him deep questions about the things of God, about Jeremiah's call and his personal experience with God. Regardless of the hows of it all, Ebed-Melech heard God's message and put it into personal practice, which could be in and of itself a message about the importance of sharing our faith stories with others. But the underlying lesson, the thread that is woven in and through this narrative of divine deliverance, is that God is steadfast and faithful. God is still and always in control when life seems out of control. God is able and faithful to deliver us out of life's chaos. God knew and chose Ebed-Melech to be an instrument. How so like God, who often uses the most unlikely servants among us to bring about divine deliverance from the lowest points in life. He takes the risk and he goes to King Zedekiah and pleads on Jeremiah's behalf. The king dispatches Ebed-Melech and 30 men to bring Jeremiah out of the cistern. One commentator supposes that the 30 were needed because everyone was so weakened by the famine and by how deep in the muck Jeremiah had sunk. But I think the particularly striking note in this story to me is the detail of finding old rags and scraps of clothing. They were to cushion the impact of the ropes used to pull Jeremiah out of the muddy cistern. It tells us something about Ebed-Melech's character. Not only is he determined to do the right thing and save a life, well, at least for the moment, because the prospects for all of Jerusalem are looking pretty dim at this point, but he thinks ahead and he's kind. He shows mercy to Jeremiah. Ebed-Melech is a tiny biblical character in the grand scheme of things, but his short moment on the biblical stage is a bright spot of courage, humanity in the sense of humaneness, and the choice of life over death, even when the choice is risky and the prospects of life are dim. That makes a good story to know and remember. God uses this unlikely person to show up at exactly the right time and lift Jeremiah out of his literal pit as well as the well of despair. Your friends and family might abandon you. You feel tossed in the metaphorical cistern, entrapped by the muck and mire of your circumstances. Watch God send someone totally unexpected, maybe even a total stranger to you, to lift you up. Likewise, you can become someone's Ebed-Melech. God can use you to be an uplifting influence, to be a beacon of hope in the life of someone who is in a dark and desolate place, to offer compassion in a simple, ordinary, but thoughtful way, like Ebed-Melech brought clothes to ease Jeremiah's pain. Beloved, when you find yourself in a hole of failure and disappointed, stuck in the muck of despair, cry out to God, hold on to hope, and remember there is no pit so deep to prevent the possibility of God's rescue. Would you pray with me?